Hello.
Good morning.
Hey.
Hey, I'm gonna pause you for a few minutes,
Sure.
and then I guess I'll call you back or something. Or yeah,
Can you pause me or call me back?
yeah, I'll just pause you. How do
All
I
right.
pause? Okay, thanks. Hi.
Hi.
We've introduced you, and if you want to tell a little bit about yourself, I told the students that you are a local person, that you're a PR historian, and that you are the new dean at Mankato. So if you want to talk a little bit about yourself, and then I'll just turn it over to you. Actually, let's welcome Dr. Cecil by Skype. Thank you. Okay, So,
Okay. My name is Matt Cecil. I am Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at Minnesota State University Mankato. I'm a Brookings native. I grew up in Brookings. My dad was a professor of journalism at SDSU and then became an administrator. I attended SDSU, graduated with a history degree, got a master's degree from Minnesota State Mankato 21 years ago. Got my PhD at the University of Iowa in the year 2000. And I was a faculty member at Purdue University and the University of Oklahoma before I came home to Brookings and was a professor there at South Dakota State for 8 years in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication. So it's great to be in Mankato because I'm much closer to home, and I do consider SDSU to be my home. So good morning, everybody, and I'm going to talk today about public relations history. And I'm sure there's nothing you'd rather hear more on a Monday morning from some guy on Skype than a recount of public relations history. Let's see if we can't make it tolerable. I'm going to share a screen here so you can see the outline of my presentation. Hopefully you see that. See a screen?
Yeah.
Heard mumbling.
you're good, yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, good. I'm going to talk today about PR history. If there's time for questions at the end, that's great. But I'm going to talk about history because history is important. A lot of people sort of think, and it's true. Human beings live in the present. We plan about the future all the time, but we don't often think about history. Probably the only time many of us think about history is when those on this date things come out on Facebook, and we were reminded of some dumb thing we posted 5 or 10 years ago. But the idea of history is important. Every idea, even common sense, has an origin. One of the things that I try to talk about with my students when I talk about history is that somebody had to invent these things. Someone had to think of this first. And it's important to understand that these were human beings just like you. There have been billions and billions of human beings just like you who encountered situations or problems and created solutions. And those solutions can offer us some kind of guidance in our own lives. Some of them provide cautionary tales, things you shouldn't do. Others remain relevant and, in this case, define a practice and help you understand the difference between public relations and simple public communication, which is less strategic. So we talk about history for a lot of reasons, but really the main reason is that we can learn something that helps us to be better at something, at being a person, at being a citizen, at being a PR practitioner. So public relations history goes way back, and you can talk about something like public opinion, which of course is really what we're addressing when we address public relations. So we want to define public opinion so we understand what we're talking about. Public opinion is the aggregate of opinions held by individual members of a community of meaning. That's my definition. Should be familiar, that idea of community of meaning is something we've talked about in this class, that interpretive community, a group of people who share similar ideas about something, who have the potential to do something about that. That is, after all, what public relations tries to do, is assemble those non-geographic communities of meaning, people who share an idea. So public opinion is just the aggregate of individual opinions, and particularly of individual opinions that share the potential for action. Certainly those opinions, those ideas help people define their identities. If you think about the election that's going on right now, people have their candidate, they have a public opinion about that candidate, and certainly it helps them to feel part of some group that's bigger than themselves, and it becomes part of their identities. And as part of their identities, then, of course, it carries the potential for them to actually do something based on that idea. In other words, what are we going to do when it comes to politics? When they measure public opinion with public opinion polling, they give us a percentage of people who support one or the other candidate. But what does that matter? Well, it matters because those people are going to eventually, theoretically, do something. They may volunteer for a campaign. They may defend their candidate against a friend's attack. They may get money through the campaign, and ultimately, obviously, the ultimate action that we're after when we create those communities and meaning in politics is their vote. We want them to vote for us. So public opinion is nothing mysterious. It's certainly something that people have been aware of for thousands of years. But we really need to look at how certain, in this case, professors and scholars started to think about public opinion as something that you could change. So when we move on and talk about public opinion as it relates to public relations, there are several people that we need to kind of talk about briefly before we move on. So again, this idea of public opinion, this potential for action among a community of meaning, is something that people have been aware of as long as there have been people. We all understand the power of group action, and certainly our ancestors are no different. If you go far back as the American Revolution, obviously the patriots of the American Revolution understood that they needed to convince people of the rightness of their cause. They needed to change public opinions regarding that. So you can go back a long time, but it's not until relatively recently, as historians look at it, that we started to have sort of thoughtful kind of explanations of what public opinion was and you could impact it. And we took sort of look at two French scholars, a guy named Gustave Le Bon and one of his students, Gabriel Tarde, as sort of exemplars of thinking about public opinion as something that could be changed or manipulated or had some potential for action. So we look at Le Bon just briefly. Gustave Le Bon was a guy who wrote a book. He wrote a book called The Crowd. This book was an attempt to understand how public opinion functioned in society. He was looking at these groups of people and trying to understand what happens. What happens when you communicate with those people? What happens when they determine a course of action? And he wrote a book called The Crowd that was a very, very pessimistic view of you and me, of everybody but the elites. A very pessimistic view of a crowd. You could have called it the mob, it would have been appropriate. He didn't believe that the rest of us were really capable of learning or understanding what was going on in our society. He believed that we were only capable of being distracted from the real important issues of the day. And he did see a role for the media in shaping that public opinion, and that role was to literally distract people from important things. While the elites, the educated, the wealthy, even the members of the clergy in his mind, those people could actually work on the important issues of democracy. The rest of us could just be distracted from those issues because we were irrational. We couldn't learn. We were a crowd, just a mob of people unable to really understand what was going on. Again, a very pessimistic view of public opinion and of the public. Gabriel Tarde was one of Le Bon's students, and he wrote a response. That's Tarde there on the slide. He wrote a response to his professor, something a lot more optimistic about the nature of all of us who weren't part of that elite crowd. And he said that we were a public instead of a crowd. And if you think of the nature of these words, the public versus the crowd, and again, you could also use the mob instead of the crowd. The public, according to Tarde, was able to understand these issues. The public was able to act upon them in a rational way. The public could be educated. The public, those of us in the public, could learn about things and generate public opinions and potential actions that would be in the greater good. Versus Le Bon, who didn't believe that we were able to do that. So Tarde's view of the public is much more in tune with the way that we see public opinion and the masses today. We see people who can be educated. And Tarde took it a little further and said that unlike Le Bon, who believed the media and public messaging could only be about distraction, Tarde saw a role for people to communicate and educate the public. Now he wasn't a long way from thinking about anything called public relations, and these guys wrote in the 1890s. So we're a long way actually talking about public relations, but at least we're talking in this case about how do you understand the power of public opinion. And Tarde gave us a model of public opinion that was a lot more positive and a lot easier for those of us today to understand that the public could be educated, was rational. The third person we talk about when we talk about these early understandings of public opinion is Walter Lippmann. I think you've probably heard about him already in this class. He wrote a book called Public Opinion. Walter Lippmann's an interesting character in history because he's considered to be one of the great American intellectuals, one of the great thinkers in American history, certainly during the 20th century. And he was a journalist of all things. We don't think of journalists typically as public intellectuals, but Walter Lippmann really was. He wrote about issues of the day. And he was thinking in terms of public opinion as this idea of creating pictures in people's heads. This notion that we consume media, we consume messages, and we sort of develop a picture of society in our heads, an understanding of the way things work. And the reason that that metaphor caught on and is so useful is that it definitely leads us in a direction where communication professionals could paint or alter those pictures in our heads. In other words, Lippmann is saying that these things can be changed, and in fact, he's suggesting that there is a place for communication professionals, and he specifically talks about communication professionals. We could look at him today and say, yeah, he's talking about PR people. He didn't have the term, but he's talking about this idea of communication professionals as people who could have an impact on public opinion. So between Le Bon's very pessimistic view, Tardet's more optimistic view, and Lippmann's notion of pictures in people's heads, we have public opinion as something that sort of is taking shape, something that we could have an impact on, something that potentially we could change, and as a result, of course, have these actions that people could take and we could sort of guide them. I should say about Lippmann one last thing. Lippmann was more of a Le Bon person than a Tardet person. When Lippmann talked about these experts in communication, he was really suggesting that we would persuade people to pay attention to these issues. Not that people would have an inherent interest, not that they would want to participate, but that we would have to persuade them. So before you start thinking of Lippmann as this great public intellectual who loves the public and wants public opinion to be shaped in a certain way, he's very pessimistic. He's another pessimist about the nature of the public. And I should say, I worked in politics as a press secretary, and I think most people in politics are more of the Le Bon view of you than they are of the Tardet view. They see you as someone often that is better distracted from issues of the day rather than. But the sum total of this awareness of public opinion, this notion of these characters, is that we understand public opinion as something that has value, that can be changed, that can result in certain kinds of actions. So, what do we do with that? What do we do with this understanding of public opinion? Well, a lot of people were doing things to try to shape public opinion before even Le Bon and Tardet and Lippmann started talking about it. And they were doing something that I like to just call PR-like activities. They're kind of like PR. We didn't have the term PR until 1920, so we had PR. But they're kind of like PR. They're sort of attempting to change public opinion. But the key point here, and really the key distinction between things that came before public relations and public relations itself, the key distinction is that PR-like activities are unstrategic, and public relations is strategic. Well, what do I mean by that? PR-like activities, I don't like to use like firearms metaphors, but if you want to think in terms of a shotgun versus a rifle. Shotgun approaches mean you're taking sort of aim in a general direction and trying to send out this cloud of messages, hoping that one of them will stick. One of them will strike the target and make a difference. That's unstrategic communication. You're essentially sending messages every way you possibly can, with every message you possibly can, hoping to impact public opinion. Versus strategic communication, which is much more of a pinpoint kind of communication. We target a small audience, a narrow section of the public, with very specific messages. So I hope that you can see the difference between PR-like activities and what I'll talk about in a minute, public relations, is this notion of strategic versus unstrategic communication. The best example, the earliest and best example of one of these PR-like activities would be a guy named P.T. Barnum, who was a circus promoter. Barnum and Bailey's Circus was founded in the 1800s, and P.T. Barnum had a saying where he said, it doesn't matter. It only matters that you get your name in the paper. It doesn't matter what the message is. The only thing that matters is that you get publicity, that you're noticed in the paper. And this is the idea of press agentry. Press agentry is unstrategic. It's just an effort to get someone's name in the paper. It's an effort to get someone's identity into the public eye. It doesn't matter whether it's the public has a positive or negative impression. And again, circus promotion. We're talking about a guy who's promoting bearded ladies and sword swallowers and things like that. It doesn't matter to him what you think of those things as long as you know that they exist. And press agentry is something that we see going way back really into the 1700s. P.T. Barnum is just the best example in the 1800s. One of the things that press agents do, it's a term that's not on the slide, but I'll spell it for you because it's an important term, is they do things called pseudo-events. Pseudo-events, and that's spelled P-S-E-U-D-O, events. P-S-E-U-D-O-E-V-E-N-T-S, pseudo-events. And if you understand a little bit of your Latin origin of words, that means essentially fake events, false events, things that really don't matter. A pseudo-event is something that's really just intended to get the attention of the media and get coverage in the media. A good example from today of a pseudo-event would be literally anything any Kardashian does ever. Those are pseudo-events. They don't matter. It doesn't have any impact on society other than that we know who these people are. We don't know exactly why they're famous, but they are. So pseudo-events are really just about getting your name in the paper. P.T. Barnum was an example of that. That's very unstrategic, is it not? You don't care about the message. You just want to get into the media. So that's a good example of an early PR-like activity is press agentry. The second one, and a little bit more structured, is something we sort of term loosely publicity. And the person who turned publicity loose on the public is a guy named Theodore Roosevelt, who of course was president in the early 1900s. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to realize sort of the power of what he called the bully pulpit. In other words, the president can stand up and say things, and people listen. People listen to the president. The media pays attention to whatever the president says. The president is a powerful figure. Words have impact on society. So when Theodore Roosevelt talked, he knew that people would listen, and he used that to his advantage in creating publicity for the things he cared about, things like national parks and conservation, something that Teddy Roosevelt cared deeply about. He was the one to go around the country and speak about that notion of conservation, creating national parks, and of course it was during his tenure as president that many of our national parks were founded. So this idea of publicity is a bit more strategic, I think, but still you've got someone sort of just wildly sending messages attempting to impact public opinion in a broad sense, talking to everyone all at once rather than a narrow strategic public. So these PR-like activities came before public relations, and they are unstrategic, and that's how they are different from what comes after. Well, let's talk about an early publicist. Some textbooks, I don't know what your textbook says, some textbooks sort of position Ivy Lee as the quote-unquote father of public relations. And I really hate that because Ivy Lee was a big old liar. Ivy Lee's whole approach to communication was to essentially confuse people to the point where they would just sort of throw up their hands and say, I don't know what the truth is. Ivy Lee his background was, he was a journalist. And all of these early pioneers, by the way, of public relations that I'm going to talk about here, there are 3 or 4 others, all of them were journalists before they became quote-unquote public relations practitioners. So Ivy Lee was a journalist. He worked for big papers. And the time period we're talking about for Ivy Lee is right around the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s, turn of the century, about the same time as Teddy Roosevelt, when what was going on in society was journalists were busy attacking big business. They were attacking big business with good reason, because big business was essentially screwing people over right and left. Money had become the only guide for business ethics at the time. It's the time of what we would call the robber barons, these super rich people who essentially ruined people on their way up and then exploited people when they got to the top. So big business was not an ethical practice at the time. And in this context, when journalists are going after big business, Ivy League, a journalist decides, oh, those poor businesses need someone to defend them. And that's how Ivy League gets into this notion of publicity. He's going to go into business to defend big business against these attacks from the muckrakers, the journalists who were going after them at the time. His point of view is very much like Le Bon. He's very pessimistic about the public's ability to understand things. He's comfortable with the notion that the public can only be distracted or confused in these sorts of conversations, public conversations. His point of view is a very negative one when it comes to you and I and our ability to understand things. Another reason why I hate the idea that anyone would call him the father of public relations. So let me just talk a little bit about the kinds of things that Ivy League did. He coined a term for what he did. He called it facticity. It's fact, F-A-C-T-I-C-I-T-Y, facticity. And really what that means is he's going to provide, quote unquote, facts to the public, but he doesn't care whether they're true or not. And in fact, it doesn't matter whether they're true, it only matters that they confuse people. It only matters that they provide the business's perspective on something that happened. So this notion of facticity is really just about confusing the issue, muddying the waters. We see this, by the way, all the time in political discourse today. This idea that if someone is after you for something that is clearly true, what you do is you come out with some sort of message or some sort of facts that just confuse things to the point where people potentially just sort of give up trying to figure out what the truth is. That's Ivy League's legacy. This is what he wanted to do. So he goes after these issues by essentially providing facts, quote-unquote facts that are not true. One of the examples of his work was he worked for a guy named Andrew Carnegie, you've probably heard of. Andrew Carnegie was a steel baron. He had owned essentially the entire steel industry in the United States, from the mines that mined the ore to the factories that created the girders for the buildings. He owned the entire industry. The problem was that Carnegie, while he later became a great philanthropist and gave away all his money, he was kind of a jerk and did not like the notion that his workers would ever rise up and ask for better treatment. And when they did, in one instance, they rose up at a mine and went on strike. Carnegie hired essentially thugs to go beat the hell out of them. And they went through and they actually murdered several people, the people that Carnegie hired. By the way, if you hire someone to beat someone up today and someone is killed, you go to prison for murder. This is Andrew Carnegie hiring people to beat people up so they'll stop striking. And he hires, to defend him in the public, he hires Ivy League. And Ivy League goes through his usual song and dance where he tries to hide the facts of the case. The facts were very simple. Carnegie hired people, people were murdered, but Ivy League tries to muddy the waters. He's actually called before a congressional hearing. And I just want to read one of his responses to a question that he was asked that shows you who this guy really was. He was asked, what effort did you make to ascertain that the facts given to you were correct? In other words, he said he was passing facts from the owners, from the Carnegie Company, to the media, and the congressperson is asking, what effort did you make to ascertain whether those were true or not? And here's Ivy League's response. He says, quote, none. I have no responsibility for the facts and no duty beyond compiling them and getting them in the best form for publicity work. I took the facts that were given to me on their word. I have no reason to believe that the word was not given in good faith. He made, unquote, he made no effort to understand whether those facts were true or not. His goal was just to confuse things. And of course, he was highly effective at it. As a result, he was nicknamed. The media called him Poison Ivy. because of the way that he attempted to confuse and muddy the waters. And that was really his approach. It's not public relations. It's certainly not what we talk about as ethical public relations today. It's really dishonest publicity work is what he was doing. Now, why would anyone believe that this guy was the parent of public relations then, including many textbook authors? Well, I think the reason they believe it is because as he was retiring from the business, he wrote a declaration of principles, claiming that these were the things that had guided his work. This declaration of principles is sort of pointed to now by people as saying, well, there's the beginning of public relations, because he's talking about things like being honest and ethical and straightforward and ascertaining whether facts were true or not. All of those things, it's a wonderful declaration of principles. It's all BS. He didn't practice any of those things that he preached in that declaration. So when you encounter this declaration of principles, I would bet that it's in your textbook. Know that it's a lovely statement, but it's completely meaningless because Ivy Lee didn't practice any of that. So this notion of Ivy Lee as the parent of public relations is, to me, just kind of ludicrous. This was a guy whose approach to communication was to lie to the media and confuse the issue. So Ivy Lee was an early publicity agent, but certainly nothing like a public relations practitioner. The next step in this evolution towards public relations, and we are heading towards public relations here, is something called the Creel Committee. This is also what's called the Committee for Public Information. It's a World War I government committee. Just a brief word about World War I. One of the things that's unique about World War I, by the way, it was called the Great War because there had been no World War II yet. One of the things about World War I that was unique was that while in the 20th century, every war that the United States got into was extremely popular at the beginning and then lost popularity over time. It kind of stands to reason, doesn't it? Someone attacks Pearl Harbor, the United States gets into World War II, a very popular patriotic effort, and over time as bodies come home and as the costs mount, wars become less popular. You can see that certainly with the Iraq War of the 90s and then the other Iraq War in the 2000s. Extremely popular at first, it became less and less popular over time, where today many people say they were mistakes. That's not to criticize the great people who fought there, it's just to say that the policy that led them to that decision to get into that war is seen now as a mistake. Well, World War I was different. World War I was viewed by most Americans as a European war that had nothing to do with us. Why would we get involved in that? That's irrelevant to us. And in fact, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, ran for re-election on a slogan that was, quote, "He kept us out of war." So he won re-election based on the idea that he kept us out of World War I. And then, of course, a year after he was re-elected, he got us into war and decided to sort of 180-degree turn because American commerce was threatened. And so rich people's money was threatened, and the United States got into World War I. So World War I was extremely unpopular at the beginning. Most Americans sitting in places like Omaha, Nebraska, or Mankato, Minnesota, or Brooklyn, South Dakota, felt like it had nothing to do with them. Why should we send our sons, in that case it was just sons, why should we send our sons to die in Europe for that? We don't like that. So the government knew it had a problem because wars are very expensive. And at the time, we didn't have money. We had to finance wars by selling bonds, war bonds. And into the war, they're not going to buy these bonds. So the Creel Committee was created primarily to change public opinion about the war so that we'd be able to sell war bonds and finance the war effort. It's a little bit of a cynical kind of move by the government, but the Creel Committee was created for that purpose. And the leader of the committee, George Creel, you see him there, was, again, a journalist. He was an Associated Press newsman. George Creel goes to work for the Creel Committee, and they start spending money. The goals of the committee were pretty simple, and they made perfect sense. There were three. One was change those anti-war feelings to enthusiasm. Well, duh, I mean, if you want to sell war bonds, first of all, people have to be enthused about the war effort. Secondly, was to intensify a feeling of national solidarity. This relates to the notion that minority groups, like German Americans, were being And German Americans at home were being harassed because of the war. So this idea of intensifying feelings of national solidarity. And then the third and most important by far of the goals of the Creel Committee was to sell war bonds to finance the war. A war bond is just a simple investment. You buy a $25 war bond at the beginning of the war, you give the government your money. At the end of the war, they give you $26 back. It's a simple transaction. So they want to sell these war bonds to make this war work. So how do they do it? What kind of tactics do they do? Well, this is an example, again, of very unstrategic communication. This is a government committee. It's a government committee with quite literally unlimited resources. If they run out of money, they just spend more. They don't have a budget. They're just told, do your job, change these anti-war feelings to enthusiasm, sell war bonds, and spend whatever you need to do it. One of the things I want you to think about is that's a very unrealistic way to think of public communication. There are no companies, even today, Apple couldn't behave that way. They couldn't spend unlimited funds on promotion and PR or advertising. So this notion that the Creel Committee had unlimited money was they were predestined to succeed, and they did. They succeeded tremendously. They changed public feelings about the war dramatically, very quickly. War bonds sold like crazy, despite the fact that at the beginning of the war, most Americans opposed it. Now that all turned around later on, by the way. By the 1930s, most Americans felt that World War I had been a complete waste. But during the war, the Creel Committee convinced them to get involved. How did they do that? Well, again, massive, unstrategic publicity. About 6,000 news releases were produced a week. 100,000 column inches of newspaper coverage every month. It's just an astonishing amount. 75,000 people were signed up as speakers to give speeches to local organizations. They would literally send them the speech text, and they would go out and they gave 800,000 speeches during this effort. So it's a huge, unstrategic effort. They're trying everything they can think of to communicate this message, and it worked. The problem with that, the legacy of this Creel Committee, and the problem is that it made people think that this sort of communication effort to change public opinion would be easy in the future. It would be easy, and in fact there was a theory of communication that came out of it called the hypodermic needle theory of communication, where you literally just inject ideas into people's heads, which of course we know is not how it works at all. Human beings carry around their own identities and their own ideas about things. You can send certain messages endlessly, and it won't change anyone's mind. But they came out of this thinking that, well, this is going to be easy going forward, no problem. And people like the people you're going to see in a minute worked for this Creel Committee. Came out of it thinking that they could easily change public opinion. So what's the next step on the road? Well, here you go. Here's the beginning of public relations. The parents of public relations are a guy named Edward Bernays and his wife, who I'll talk about in a minute, Doris Fleischman. And Bernays, this is one of the most famous Americans of the 20th century, by the way. The guy lived to be 104 years old. Huge ego. I think he wrote 4 memoirs in his life. Very proud of himself. Rarely mentioned his wife in any of those memoirs, as if it was entirely him who had done all of this. But this was the guy who created public relations, along with his wife, Doris Fleischman. And he would say, famously, he said it all started with sex. Understanding people's motivations is the background of public relations. So who was this guy, Edward Bernays? Well, he was a journalist, again. He worked for trade magazines, agricultural trade magazines primarily, and health communication kinds of trade magazines in New York State. His uncle was someone you may have heard of. Edward Bernays' uncle was a guy named Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud, whose entire life's work was about figuring out what motivated people to do what they do. This is an important idea, by the way. If you're thinking about the difference between public relations and what came before it, this notion of unstrategic versus strategic communication. Edward Bernays borrowed heavily from his uncle Sigmund's work about motivations, about why people do what they do. That's the difference between public relations and things that came before it. Public relations practitioners try to understand why people do what they do, why they feel the way they feel about certain things, so that then they can craft messages to try to address those and either reinforce or change those feelings and motivations. So it's not surprising, I guess, that the person who creates public relations is related to Sigmund Freud, the famed father of psychoanalysis. So Edward Bernays is this journalist, and he goes to see a play. We're going to get into theatrical promotion of all things. He goes to see a play called Damaged Goods. This is the aha moment for Edward Bernays. Oftentimes it's really hard to say when someone has an idea that changed everything. But for Bernays, it was this play called Damaged Goods, and it's a horrifically terrible play. It's one of the. Here's the plot. In Damaged Goods, a man with syphilis gets married and fathers a child who also has syphilis. That's the play. Would you go see that? I doubt it. It's a story that really is about hypocrisy. It's an attack on hypocrisy of men at the time. Many wealthy men had mistresses outside of marriage, and oftentimes they contracted venereal diseases and passed those along. So that's what this play is about. It's an attempt to sort of say it's a social commentary really about the hypocrisy of wealthy men in society at the time. But it's not the kind of thing that anybody's going to want to go see. So Bernays sees the play and has this idea that he can promote this thing, that he can get people to go to this terrible play, and he comes up with a way to do that. And the method that he comes up with is he's going to go talk to ordinary people. The audience he's going to go after for this play is ordinary working class people, people who typically would not go to a play. And what's the message he's going to send? Well, he talks to them, and talks to them about their aspirations for life and what they want to do, and he discovers that many of those people want to be wealthy someday. Many of those people also know of these stories of the hypocrisy of wealthy men. You put those things together, and he thinks, I can promote this play as a public health message. As a public health message, how to avoid falling into that trap. It goes right around the problem of the play being horrible. It goes around the problem of the message of the play, and goes right to some other things. For example, he signs up wealthy people. People like the Roosevelts and the Vanderbilts, the wealthiest people in New York, as sort of patrons of this play. Puts their name on things. Tells them it's a public health message that people need to see. Well, that addresses people's aspirations to become wealthy. So he creates a message that essentially says, you should see this because the Roosevelts went and saw it, or the Vanderbilts saw it. And you can be like them, which is something that people aspire to. It's a roundabout way. It's not a direct sort of message about a play. You're not going to working class people and saying you need to see this play because it's about public health, because that's who's gonna respond to that. And then instead, it's you need to go see this play because the Roosevelts are recommending it and you want to be like them. This is what Bernays does. He goes to the audience, does research, gains insight into the audience, and then crafts messages based on that insight. That's the difference between public relations and what came before it. This insight into the audience that makes public relations strategic. That's the difference. That's the invention here. That's the moment where somebody created something new, something that would really, frankly, change public communication and the media forever. This notion that you could send these messages that address people's concerns. So Bernays creates this company that does theatrical work, becomes very rich, works his way through various kinds of productions. One example of the theatrical work that he did was the Russian ballet. The Russian ballet was coming to America. Ballet, very sort of high culture, not exactly a working class phenomenon. I would bet that most of you in the room there have never been to a performance of a ballet. But Bernays signs on to promote this Russian ballet to working class people across America. He's going to get people in Omaha, Nebraska to go to the ballet. He's going to try to get people in Minneapolis to go to the ballet. And so he tries to figure out ways to do this. Now, a little bit about the context of this. The Russian ballet was coming in the early 1920s, right after the Russian Revolution. So there'd been this great upheaval in Russian society that Americans were fascinated with. So he knows that there's something there that he can use to promote this. The other thing is, ballet dancers tend to be very, very physically fit, attractive people. And this is where it all started with sex comes in. He's going to promote this based on the notion of sort of spies and spycraft, these Russians coming to America, and sex. He's going to get people, working class people who work in a meatpacking plant in Omaha, to come to this play based on the idea that it's sexy. And it's also got that mysterious sort of intrigue. These people could all be spies. And so he does that. He works with media around the country to promote this. There are articles about, for example, how ballet costumes were held together with pins, and that they could, as if they could just pop right off at any moment, this notion of sex. He publishes photos in the New York Times of a member of the Russian ballet, wearing a snake, only a large snake, obviously pushing the sex idea there. He publishes articles or pushes articles to the media about the Russian Revolution and how some of these ballet people may be spies. It's all of this effort, again, to go around the notion of the ballet as this high culture and get people intrigued by it. What motivates people to do stuff? His insight is that sex motivates people to do stuff, which is a pretty safe insight. It certainly does. And he uses that to promote this Russian ballet. It was a huge success across the country. So one more example of what Bernays did, because this one has some implications, many implications still today. And that's this Torches of Freedom campaign that Bernays undertook. This idea, by the way, just quickly, is he needs to promote cigarette smoking to women. Women don't smoke in the early 1900s. Men do because they went to war and smoked a lot. Women don't smoke, so he's going to promote smoking with these women. He does that by essentially making smoking healthy. This notion of smoking healthy, and he does that by changing the nature of what's considered beautiful for a woman. In the 1920s and 1930s, a normal woman was considered beautiful, a woman with curves, a woman who doesn't look like she's starved herself. Unlike the ideas of beauty today, the models, the stick-thin, insect-free model ladies who are models today, you can trace this notion of changing perceptions of what's beautiful in American society back to Edward Bernays. This notion that we all know cigarette smoking keeps you from eating, and thus you're thinner. So he links smoking to health and being thin, and he uses every possible tactic that he can, from including cigarettes on dessert menus, to building cigarette storage in kitchens, everything you can imagine. And cigarette smoking among women skyrockets because they want to be like those thin women that are now appearing in the magazines thanks to Bernays. And the last part of Torches of Freedom was this idea that we have to convince women that it's okay for women to smoke in public. It was not considered ladylike at the time. So he creates this pseudo-event where he starts one of his models walking down Fifth Avenue in New York City, smoking, and literally walking down the middle of Fifth Avenue smoking. And she is, quote-unquote, spontaneously joined by other stick-thin models who are also smoking. And so there's just this mob of insect ladies walking down Fifth Avenue smoking in public, convincing other women that this is okay. That's the Torches of Freedom March. He has linked smoking then to women's rights, your right to smoke in public. So again, an example of Bernays going around these ideas and finding a way to promote something. Last slide, quickly. Let's get to it. Last slide. Looking at what I just talked about, looking at all those things that Bernays did, this effort to kind of go around and figure out a new way towards motivation. The question is, what makes PR a real thing? And that's this insight into the audience. That's why you're in a class for PR. That's why when you graduate with a PR degree, you're going to get a job, because you understand that strategic communication requires this insight into the audience versus unstrategic communication. And you understand that there's this focus on relationship and identity versus simple transaction. We're not just buying messages, we're trying to craft messages and send them inexpensively to certain groups of people, with the goal of creating this potential for action. And that's what makes PR a thing. That's what Bernays teaches us, and that's why it's important to be able to manage public opinion. That's a lot of stuff.
Okay. Thank you so much. Do you want to really quickly, you have like a minute, tell them about your Festival of Books thing?
Oh, yeah, sure. Are they doing something with Festival of Books?
No, but you're going to be here, so.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be in Brookings on September, I think, 22nd and 23rd with my 2 books at the Festival of Books. Dr. Freeman could share that information with you, and I'd love to see you in any of those presentations. And we can discuss all these important things I talked about today, because I'm sure you're fascinated.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, guys.
Bye.